Recently in the community, there has been a lot of discussion about if killer is harder, to the point where several other creators, and I, have all covered it. Perks like Botany Knowledge and Resurgence have had huge talking points in this, but recently a new perk has been taking the focus of other players: Vigil. What Vigil does is remove 40% of the recovery of the following effects: blindness, broken, exhausted, exposed, hemorrhage, hindered, mangled, and oblivious. We're not going to cover all these because I really only think there's a handful of them that are impactful enough. Before that though, I do want to talk about how we got here. Vigil was buffed in patch 8.5.0 along with the Freddy rework. This patch served as a sort of re-release of the Nightmare chapter, with 4 of the 6 perks being changed in some way. While the changes to Remember Me and Wake Up were both rather uneventful in the grand scheme of the game, the other 2 perks, Fire Up and Vigil, both received pretty large glow-ups. Fire Up is now much more effective than it was back during its meme days. Vigil, on the other hand, has pretty much always been good. You may have thought I was going to talk about how Vigil was similar to Fire Up, but no. Pre-buff Vigil is a semi-popular perk when paired with exhaustion perks or fixated. Quickly, I'm going to give a quick history lesson on Vigil. Vigil was released on October 26, 2017, with the Nightmare on Elm Street chapter. Quentin looked like a goblin, and Freddy was the worst killer in Dead by Daylight history. I'm sure you've heard it all before, so I'm not going to go over all that again. However, in patch 2.3.0, Vigil received its first buff, which is something that has come back to bite behavior this many years later. Starting with this patch, Vigil will now linger for an additional few seconds after leaving the radius of a teammate's Vigil. This is currently one of the strongest aspects of the perk. However, at the time was not quite the case due to the perk having only half of its current strength. This would change in patch 5.3.0, where Vigil was given yet another buff, bringing the maximum recovery speed from 20% to 30%. Also in this patch, Vigil will begin to affect Broken, Exposed, and Oblivious. So this is the state that Vigil remained in for years. I decided to look when this patch happened. This was all the way back on the 19th of October in 2021, when the Hour of the Witch was released, adding Boons and Michaela to the Survivor roster. Vigil was left alone for an almighty 1200 days before being changed once again in patch 8.5.0 to the state it is today. 40% recovery of all status effects that I've mentioned, as well as doubling the stacking range from 8 meters to now a massive 16 meters, with the lingering effect that the perk received all those years ago. Now that we've covered the history of the perk, let's get back on track. I'm going to go over what I consider the biggest issues with the perk and what can be done to alleviate some of the pain points. I'm going to try and cover what I consider the big 3 as fast as I can, because you've certainly almost heard about all of these. First, the major issue for most players is the existence of the 40% reduction to exhaustion timer. This will bring the timer down to 32 seconds instead of the usual 40 seconds. This becomes much stronger when paired with perks like Sprint Burst and Dramaturgy especially, however can work well along with Life or Smash Hit as well. I'm going to try and ignore the lesser used perks that pair with Vigil and focus my attention on Sprint Burst and Dramaturgy because they just work much better with the perk in comparison to everything else. The constant rerolls of Dramaturgy allows for survivors to set themselves up for those beneficial effects due to the no repeat mechanic, meaning a survivor cannot get exposed twice in a row. However, even in a situation where a survivor does roll exposed, Vigil severely counters that as well. Drama goes from a perk with an extremely strong upside and a justifiable downside to a perk with an extremely strong upside and a very minuscule downside. Speaking of no downsides though, let's shift our attention to the funny haha perk, Sprint Burst. Sprint Burst is one of, if not the easiest exhaustion perk in the game to use right now, with so many use cases that players can easily get extreme use out of. Pre-running becomes much stronger, as well as 99ing your Sprint Burst in Chase. Having the Sprint Burst up much more of the time due to the shorter cooldown that Vigil offers has led to lower tier killers really struggling to deal with a mechanic that is arguably extremely outdated already. Moving on from exhaustion, the effects of blindness, oblivious, and arguably exposed aren't the strongest effects for killers necessarily, but the perk does hard counter more niche, interesting perks like Ultimate Weapon Side Effect or Hex Haunted Ground. Because why would you want people to use perks that are off meta? Now, you may be wondering, why didn't I also list Hindered in that? Quite frankly, Hindered is something that isn't often seen in killer perks. I can only really think of Forced Hesitation or Nothing But Misery. I mean, granted, they are hit pretty hard by this, but believe it or not, despite what the wiki currently says, Vigil does currently absolutely kneecap Freddy and Clown's power. So here's where I'm going to show you what Vigil does to Freddy's Hinder, with and without the jump rope add-on. As for Clown, I'm not really much of a Clown player, especially after the tragedy that happened this patch, but I'm sure you can find someone in the comments that can confirm or deny how much Vigil affects Clown. As for Freddy though, I can provide the context to that, and yeah, it does hurt him quite badly. I've been pushing for this to be changed since June. The most common pushback I've gotten is the comparison of Calm Spirit countering Doctor, which, first thing, it's not even close to the same thing. Secondly, Vigil also does about 5 extra things other than just stepping on Freddy's head. And the third thing, Calm Spirit's just a bad perk. One usage will bring Freddy's snare down to 2.7 seconds instead of his usual 4.5 second hinder. 2 uses of Vigil will bring it down to less than a second of hindered. In a straight line, Vigil has less of an effect because it's just running in a straight line. Still an effect, granted. A lot of the time, Freddy, the hits can just be extremely close, especially inside of loops. But once inside a loop, Freddy not only has to hit the snare at a time where it can catch up, but now account for a perk that a survivor might or might not have. Pair this with Freddy not being able to force medium vaults as much because of the reduced hindered effect, it leads to his snares being downright laughable at times. But moving on from this, because I don't really have much else to say that I haven't already said about it on Twitter, so if you want to see my full ramblings about how much I hate Vigil affecting my killer so much, you can follow me on Twitter at Kassir. Finally though, the massive nerf to Hangled, and to a less relevant extent, Hemorrhage. Let's cover the history of a formerly very strong killer playstyle called Hit and Run. The killer would equip anti-heal, namely Sloppy Butcher and or Thanatophobia, to slow survivor healing speeds down a lot. The main killers who benefited from this playstyle were Ghostface, Wraith, and like Hag, maybe? I don't know, I'm not really the biggest fan of the playstyle, but that's not really the point. Over time, we've seen nerfs to everything related to the playstyle. Sloppy Butcher and Thana were given direct nerfs over the years. Most recently, survivors had buffs to Botany Knowledge, Desperate Measures, and the introduction of Do No Harm. The balance of the effect being good, with adequate counterplay, has been thrown off massively with all these changes. Pair this with the relevance of Vigil, and you'll just see how laughable it is. One instance of Vigil will remove 36 seconds from the 90-second timer from Sloppy Butcher, bringing it to a 54-second timer, making the perk even less effective than it currently is. So, for a quick recap, Vigil currently makes exhaustion better, which is arguably the strongest thing survivors can bring. It also counters a killer playstyle popular among some of the weakest killers in the game. And as the final touch, if you're unfortunate enough to be a Freddy main like I am, the perk dunks on your main power. And like I mentioned earlier, there is absolutely no downside to this perk. It's very strong in solo, very strong in a group due to the stacking and lingering, and can sometimes be extremely hard to spot unless you're actively looking out for it. So, what could theoretically be done to fix this? Well, I came up with a list of a few things. First and most importantly, remove stacking from the perk. 40% being stacked multiple times with a massive range is actually just crazy to me. This allows for survivors to get the effect almost constantly stacked if in a group. Even if you're not in a group, as I mentioned earlier, the perk is currently fairly common, so you'll see it more often than you would in the past. Removing the ability to stack would prevent survivor teams from stacking their perk and negating status effects even further than Vigil already does by itself, as well as making the 60-meter range completely redundant, so just go ahead and remove that. This would equal out the perk between Survive with Friends and Solo Queue, which is something behavior really needs to do with just the game in general. I considered suggesting a change to revert the perk back to the former 30%, but quite frankly, I think Vigil is relatively fine at 40% once it can no longer be stacked. You could argue that even the solo 40% is too good, and I don't know if I would disagree with you if I'm being honest, it might just be too strong. But in my fantasy changes, I think I would keep it at 40%. And finally, the biggest one for me is to make Vigil no longer hard counter Freddy, and maybe Clown. I don't know for sure if it does, but I think it does. But because why does a perk do this? That's this good. It's just silly. That's it though. These changes would make Vigil a more selfish perk, to be fair, but would ultimately eliminate the extremely problematic stacking aspects that the perk currently has, as well as keeping the 40% that is genuinely very strong, before finally making the perk no longer gut two killers unfairly. You may be thinking these are such small changes, but honestly, small changes to not only Vigil, but all unbalanced perks can and will lead to a healthier meta for all players, instead of people just using the overtuned perks. That's all for today. My name is Kassir. Like, comment, subscribe, check out the Twitch and the Discord. I hope I'll see you next time. I got a video planned on this this current patch we had. Trust me, it was real good. I'm doing a thumbs down right now. You can't see it though. Anyways, I'll see y'all next time. Bye bye. Oh man, what a dog shit patch.